And we want to make sure that we get everything in. So welcome everyone to this month's episode of DEI. Is it a moment or a movement, a progress report? My name is Sacha Thompson. I am the founder of the Equity Equation, and I will be your hostess for the evening. So really excited to have you with us as we have this conversation about diversity, equity, and inclusion. So our webinar comes 2 years after the civil unrest that spanned the globe after the murder of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor. Breonna. And wanted to make sure that we were following up. So 6 months after a lot of the statements were made, we did a webinar talking about, okay, 6 months have happened, now what? And so now we're 2 years out and want to make sure, are we still on track, right? Was this, or what were all of the activities a moment, or was it part of a larger movement? And so really excited to have this conversation this evening with Dr. Laura Morgan Roberts from the University of Virginia and Dr. Ella Washington from Georgetown University. And they've both actually co-authored a Harvard Business Review article 2 years ago entitled U.S. Businesses Must Take Meaningful Action Against Racism. So we can tap into that. They're both also authors in their own right as well too, and do work in this space. So first of all, I want to welcome you both to this conversation today. So we're just going to dive right in. If you all have questions, if you are watching and you have questions, please feel free, utilize the chat, utilize the Q&A section as well too. We will be able to, I will try to pull some of those questions in as we go along as well. All right, so we are now, as I said, 2 years out from this conversation. And, last week, I believe it was Bloomberg had an article stating that many employees are noticing, okay, we're 2 years out and we're not seeing much of a difference. We're not seeing much of a change. They're seeing some activities happening, but they're really not feeling the impact of the larger movement. And so, Laura, I want to start with you. And so can you kind of start with us and talk to us about the roles that corporations can play or should be playing in this space at this time?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, Sacha. It's an honor to be here. The conversation itself is sobering, but it always uplifts my spirit and my energy when I have the opportunity to sit down with Ella and with yourself and so many other who are partners with the PhD project. If I were to answer directly, what should corporations be doing? Corporations should be supporting organizations like the PhD project. What we're doing, the kind of change that people are looking for is both quantitative and qualitative. And let me start by saying that in the conversation, if we're talking about 2 years post George Floyd, it's important that we have that conversation with a level of precision and care around identities, because what has happened over the past 2 years is we moved from the outrage of the treatment of yet another Black man in the United States facing injustice, where the perpetrator, who in this case, as in many others, was a police officer who had not faced repercussions for the injustice and the horror and the violence that had been enacted upon this Black man, George Floyd. And that had happened in broad daylight, in such a moment of sharp contradiction where literally around the planet, people are quarantining, often by mandate, not even by choice, so that we can preserve human life and the quality of life. And to see broadcast all over the world this vicious, callous disregard for yet another Black life was shocking and poignant, and really told the tale of contradiction. How can we say that we'll fight so hard for freedom? How can we say we'll fight so hard for people to be alive, and yet walking up and down the street, coming out of a convenience store, could result in you breathing your last breath in such a terrifying and tragic way? 2 years later, do people feel more safe? Do they feel more safe on our streets? Do they feel more loved? Do they feel more compassion and care? Do they feel healthier? You know, as members, and when I'm saying people now, I'm not going to be generic, let's be specific. How do Black people feel today compared to 2 years ago? Because that was the impetus of this work. So then that begs the question, how should corporations respond? Corporations should continue to be outraged. Leaders should continue to be outraged, not corporations in the generic, depersonalized sense, not a brand, not a hashtag, not a campaign. Humans, leaders should be outraged by the continued grief, loss, and suffering that is occurring throughout our society. Leaders should be investing resources in sustained ways to uplift, to support, to equip, to encourage all of those who are pushing forward in this journey toward justice, equity, and inclusion. We have more time tonight to talk about the myriad issues in other communities that are being adversely impacted by a lack of care and compassion and a lack of disregard for human life. But one of the things that has gotten lost over the past 2 years is this explicit focus on race and suffering of Black people, not just in the streets of Minneapolis or Louisville or Charlottesville, where I'm on faculty, but in the boardrooms, in the Zoom rooms, virtual and face-to-face, where people are still being told that the experiences that they're having of suffering and injustice are not legitimate, they're not valid, they're not actually happening, and or that it's not leaders' responsibility, read white leaders' responsibility or non-Black leaders' responsibilities to address those issues and challenges. So that's my 2 years in a 2-year arc.
I love it because
unfortunately we have a lot more time to talk.
Yeah, but one of the things that you hit on, I think, is a critical piece of this conversation, which is when corporations immediately came out with their black boxes on social media or their statements, one of the reasons why there was so much pushback is because their Black employees were saying, Black Lives Matter, really? Because I'm here and it doesn't matter inside this organization, right? And so that kind of forced a change that we hadn't seen before in this space. But to your point, I honestly believe that that initial message has gotten lost in, well, we got a lot of time, but a lot of the performative things that are happening right now, and it kind of overshadows the movement that was initially brought up 2 years ago. So Ella, I want to get your voice, and there is too, have we seen progress in the last 2 years?
So one thing you just said, and hi everyone, a pleasure to be here. Always excited to be with my PhD project family. So thank you for having me. One of the things you just said, Sacha, was they were forced to make a change. And I would kind of edit that. I think they were forced to acknowledge.
Yes.
What Laura and I wanted them to do, and I see I'm frozen, so sorry, y'all. What Laura and I wanted them to do is to make a meaningful change. And I think that is yet to be seen. So they did acknowledge, and we are happy that they started on that path, but that is not enough, right? Yeah. And I think a part of their acknowledgement, and they wanted to make changes. I tend to believe positive intent, because if I don't believe it, I can't do this work. I'll be honest. It gets too daunting. But let's assume that they had positive intent with those beautifully written messages and the Black squares and all of that. What they did not have, I think, is realistic expectations. They did not do the work that's necessary to understand the short and long-term needs to make meaningful change. Culture does not change overnight in any organization, ever, right? One person can't change a culture. One moment can't change a culture. It can bring awareness, but it cannot bring meaningful change. And so one of the largest gaps I see with organizations, they were rushing just to do something. And the phrase I hate, what are the low-hanging fruit? What can we do right now, right? And what I try to tell them is we can have short-term and long-term goals. So yes, there are some things that we can implement today, and hopefully we'll see some shorter term impacts. But the real work, the long-term, the sustainable work that Laura was talking about, it has to come over time. And people say that and everyone nods their head like, yeah, of course. But the reality is that they still expected change to happen overnight. And by the way, accountability has been one of those shaky things. I see somebody put that in the chat because, 2 years ago, it was like 3% of Fortune 500 companies that release their data, their transparent data. Now, and when I say data, their demographics, their promotions, all of those types of things. I think what's interesting, if you follow some of the work on transparency and data reporting, there has been a push by some organizations. I think Fortune has partnered with some organizations to try to increase the level of transparency. And their most recent data was about like 47% of those companies of the Fortune 500 do report some demographic data. So that's good. So when you ask, has there been progress? Sure, there has been progress. But let's break it down a little bit, because when you peel back the onion, you look at that data, and what they're saying is 47% as opposed to 3 to 7% share some data, but only 7% to date actually share demographics. Yep. They really get down to the demographics. And so it's like, sure, progress has been made and that's great, but it's not enough. There's still barriers holding us back. And by the way, leaders who think they've done this thing for 2 years, they've, wrote the check for 2 years, showed up to the meetings for 2 years, they think they're done, or they think they're on a pathway to sustainable change. And it's just not that easy. So, I could go on, but I will allow other voices in this conversation. But I think ultimately, yes, there's been progress. I won't deny that. I think the acknowledgement was a huge progress. And Laura and I really wanted to urge companies to do something meaningful. In the letter the article we penned with HBR, we made it really plain some of the things that organizations can do. And we're so happy that, that article got lots of traction. But it's almost like HBR needs to send an annual reminder, like, we can't just forget, the advice that we gave 2 years ago still stands. And so I'll let you all chime in, but that's kind of where I'm sitting from reflecting on the last 2 years.
No, I love it. I love it. Because what I wrote down when you talked about acknowledgement, I always talk about 2021 being the year of acknowledgement, right? Everyone's eyes got open to, oh my gosh, there's problems. And I'm like, we need to move from acknowledgement to action, right? Now that what are you going to do about it? And what I have noticed, or what I have seen, is what you both kind of spoke about, was what's the low-hanging fruit? And some of that low-hanging fruit is rotten. Like, I'll just put it out there, right? Some of that low-hanging fruit was just rotten. And I think this year, probably more than anything, we've seen that, right? So we are now on the eve-esque of Juneteenth. We are in the middle of Pride Month. And so companies have been planning how they're going to celebrate these things in a very capitalistic way that didn't strike the right chords, right? And so how do we, for me, those are moments, right? Okay, we're just going to check a box and say we did X, Y, and Z. But the impact is probably more negative than what they wanted, right? The intent wasn't aligned with the impact. And so I know, Laura, you and I talked about that a little bit, and how some of these companies are challenged. They want to get something done, but it may not be the right thing. And they may not be be being led by the right people to do the right thing?
Absolutely. I think there is, for many, you said a couple of really important things. I'm trying to think about which one I actually
I just threw it all out there.
first. The rotten low hanging fruit is like really there in my mind, but we'll circle back to that in a minute. Um, to your point right now, I too, like Ella, believe that there are a lot of people out there. More people want a different way to live.
Yeah.
And a different way to work than the ways in which we're living and working. And when we look at all of the social issues that are, facing targeted resistance and oppression of the liberties and freedoms of various communities, and look at the national polling within the US, and the majority of people polled want to live in pursuit of humane ways of organizing, of coexisting, of collaborating, of affirming, supporting, and preserving one another's lives and livelihoods. So, I come in with that set of assumptions that there are strong and loud voices, just like the handful of disgruntled students at the end of every course, every semester, who fill out those course evals and pull down the average for the whole course. And we know that they're not representative. Everybody doesn't even fill out the evals. And the majority of the people could have thought it was just fine. But you have those few voices that get really loud, and then they start to pull down the energy and redefine the narrative. And so then socially, you start to believe the hype. You start to believe that the majority is not, in fact, in favor of these things, but that the minority are. So that's my first set of reflections is, okay, so what's my belief going in here? My belief is that people are envisioning or more aligned around the kind of world that they want to lead and live than not. Mm-hmm. So then where's the gap? What gets us from, that desire to things falling flat or even doing more harm than good? And I would say that that's when people are not willing to get on the learning curve.
Yeah.
That's what's missing. It's a dedication and a commitment to learning. So if I'm in the classroom and I know what students are there just to check a box, to get some credit so that they can move on, get credit for that course, and then, pursue their career, versus those who are really there and interested and invested in learning.
Yeah.
So that's where leaders need to be. This is a conversation about learning. That's why it's a long game. Because when adults are learning, this is transformative learning. We're unlearning a lot of things that we thought about the world. And a lot of things that we thought about the world may be true when it applies to us, but not true when it applies to other people. So they need to be equipped with a deeper level of understanding and a different set of skills to be able to sit and hold these conversations. One of the things that needs to come in that learning journey is the ability to put your ego aside and to not prioritize your comfort over somebody else's suffering. And the broader narrative of that group of disgruntled folks, the ones who were in the minority, and I think we should call them that, just to, shift that narrative. But they're the ones who are saying we shouldn't keep doing this work. We should, abandon it. Those commitments that we made, those efforts that we tried, we're not going to stick with it, Ella. We wanted to, but it got too hard. It felt too hard. It made me feel uncomfortable. I feel like this isn't fair. I feel like I'm being excluded. And so therefore, we need to make sure that we're being more inclusive in our work on DEI, which is usually code for stop focusing so much on the marginalized, minoritized, and excluded groups, and make sure that you're saying and doing things that are going to benefit me and my family as a dominant person, a person who already has power in this organization. So I said that a lot. That's more philosophical in my analysis. One of my closest mentors, Dr. Robert Sellers of the University of Michigan, gives a visual metaphor for this. He says it's like pushing a boulder up the hill,
I say it all the time.
right? So the progress is, did we push it? Yes, we did. If at any point we stop, it's not going to just stand still. It's going to start rolling back down the hill. So there always has to be some level of continued sustained effort.
And I would even add to that analogy is, if you're behind the boulder and you stop pushing, it's going to flatten you.
Okay.
And what I mean by that is, we started pushing this boulder, we got all excited. And by we, I mean corporations. And if we stop, it's going to be worse than if we never even started. And I think that is what scares me. And it scared me 2 years ago. And I often talk about the emotion. When Laura and I were getting together to write that article, I was excited. I was ready. I was like, okay, let's do something. Let's make an impact. Let's talk about it. And I was actually really thrilled, truly thrilled, when I was looking online and seeing all these statements, seeing these companies, seeing the beauty companies who never say anything about Black people, right? Seeing all these organizations that would not touch this with a 10-foot pole just, 3 months prior. Oh, and by the way, those same companies who had laid off their chief diversity officers, but we can get to that later. But seeing all that, it did excite me. But at the same time, I was fearful of this moment, because I know, like Laura knows, Sacha, like DEI is not a new thing. It's not a flavor of the month. The study of diversity management is at least 40 years old, and it has roots in the civil rights and affirmative action movements before that. So it is not a new thing, and we know that, right? But the way folks were treating it as this brand new shiny thing, I'm like, I don't know, because if we push this boulder up the hill, it's going to be worse. Just like an employee engagement, when you ask someone their perspective and you don't do anything about it, it's worse than if you never ask them at all. And I think, going back, Sacha, to the Bloomberg article that you were referencing, that's what we're seeing. You gave people the Kool-Aid. Some folks started drinking the Kool-Aid. Okay, the organization's hired a chief diversity officer. The organization's brought in such and such consultant to help us. The organization now has a DEI team. Oh, the organization now has employee resource groups. We're seeing that boulder is moving. But then, now that the boulder is slipping back, it's even more harmful, because some folks did at least want to believe the corporations. And I think, going back to your reference on the Juneteenth commercialization, now that one struck a nerve. I'm going to be honest with y'all, PhD project family, and I am in a lot of tough and uncomfortable conversations with executives and students, and not much gets to me, but that got to me. It got to me, especially, and for me personally, it wasn't the commercialization of Juneteenth. That did make me cringe, but this is America, and unfortunately, we commercialize everything.
Right.
Okay, so we can pick a holiday, Christmas, Resurrection Sunday, Easter in America, or whatever holiday you want, Pride Month, Black History Month, the list goes on. It has been commercialized. And so we can break that down. But moving even from that space, it's like, well, who's benefiting from the commercialization?
Yeah.
Right. And so if this is America and this is just what we do, because that's how we do, why not be thoughtful and allow those same organizations that billions were pledged to benefit from the commercialization of Juneteenth and these other holidays? And some corporations have done that, like Target. I know, they have signs like, this is benefiting a Black-owned business or a woman-owned business. But so many organizations are not being thoughtful, and quite frankly, they're being greedy, right? I think, what was making the waves around the IP rights to Juneteenth something by a corporation just days after it became a federal holiday. It makes your stomach turn. It really does. And I think the final thing I'll say on the commercialization piece, it hurt me personally when I saw some of the phrases that seem to make light of the horrors of slavery. I think
it's the freedom for me, or something like that.
So that's the one. That is the one. It's the freedom for me.
Oh,
it was on a napkin.
On a napkin.
Oh, okay.
That's the one that made me toss and turn, because as a Black person, this is real for me. These are my ancestors. I am not from African descent in terms of I know my African ancestors. I am African American. So my ancestors, I know, were slaves. And to make light of it and make it a colloquial statement, a pop culture reference, is just inappropriate and inconsiderate to the real pain that Black people have gone through in this country and are still going through in this country. So, you know, like I said, I deal with a lot, I see a lot, and most stuff rolls off my shoulders, but that one definitely struck a nerve.
Yeah.
And I feel it's so on brand with the way that Black people have been treated, have been exploited, have been abused and oppressed as capital. So for the cultural capital, for the intellectual capital, for the social capital, and for centuries, the financial capital. Like each of us had a dollar sign associated with us at that, you know, for centuries here.
And still do to some degree.
And still do to some degree. And when we look at, you talked about the low hanging fruit and the rotten fruit, and that did make me think about the watermelon salad and the, you know, all the other things that were commoditized with Juneteenth. And then like, yes, because it's just so on brand to find yet another way to take a cherished and sacred aspect of the Black experience and profit from it. So, you know, I'd appreciate, like you mentioned, Ella, you know, Target, and when other corporations are able to highlight how they are supporting and investing in Black-owned business. But, you know, that's a long-term endeavor as well.
And
so
I think that that's an
excellent. What happens over time, right, Sacha?
Yeah, exactly. I was going to say that I think is a great example of the movement or moment, right? Yeah. The moment, yep, let's just do this, get it out the door. But when you're talking about the long-term investment, you know, using Target, for example, yes, for Black History Month, they highlighted Black creators, right? But they didn't drop it in February. They're continuing to do that work with those Black creators, right? The same with the LGBTQ plus community. And so it's, how do you take the work that you're doing, impact the communities that are most impacted by, or you can reach actually through your natural work, right? Through retail, through financial services, through whatever it is, to do it long-term. And so I think that's part of what makes it more of a movement that's aligned with the long-term strategies of DEI work. And that's what we need to do. So I'm looking, excuse me, a couple of questions came up. So one question that came up was, how might corporations lead in action from its leaders? I'm always taken aback by the comments directed at Black Americans. What are you going to do for Black History Month or Juneteenth? It should not be the plight of us to do something. So any thoughts?
Well, I think that the question nailed it, right? I mean, we see so many examples of the folks in the marginalized communities being asked to take on the burden of work, to be more included, to find ways to celebrate, and not being compensated for that extra work. You know, they want folks to lead the employee resource groups that take so much time for their jobs, or have dual roles that they don't get paid for the second chief diversity officer role. And in so many instances, people are not asking for, you know, that recognition. Even if it's not compensation, there should be some formal recognition. So we see it all the time. And it's also, it helps us to go backwards in some ways, because at that point, it's always seen as the Black initiative and the Black employees are doing that, instead of it really being something that everyone in the organization is responsible for, figuring out how we're going to acknowledge and understand and celebrate a Juneteenth or a Pride or a Black History Month or Women's History Month, et cetera. It can't be on the shoulders of those who should be the ones, you know, enjoying said celebration or feeling acknowledged and feeling seen. I can't feel seen if I got to work night and day just to pull out this program with no support from other folks in the organization.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Laura, you want to add anything to that?
Definitely would echo, amplify, shout from the mountaintop, the
Hashtag.
hashtag, the key points about making sure that this work is acknowledged and recognized as leadership within the corporation. This is critical. These are critical leadership functions. This is not an add-on. This is not the social club with different party planning and things to help people, have something fun to look forward to every month. This is about the core operations of your organization, whether you're in higher ed, whether you're in a nonprofit, whether you're in the government, and whether you're in corporate. And all of those, DEI is central. It should be central to your strategy. It should be central to operations. It should be central to employee engagement. So anybody within your organization who has the wisdom and the experience to be able to lead in that work should be valued as one of your most powerful and critical leaders for 2022 and beyond. Now, I do draw a caveat here because not everybody has the wisdom or the experience to lead this work effectively in the way that it needs to be led. And there is not a direct correlation between your socio-demographic categories and your ability to lead this work. There are many members of the PhD project who are brilliant scholars in their domains and do not do this work. And that's perfectly acceptable, and they should be able to thrive and flourish in their areas of expertise. Ella and I have chosen to take a deep dive in our research and in our teaching within this domain. And because of that, I will continue to advocate for it being valued and acknowledged and rewarded appropriately, fairly, and equitably. It's very hard work. It scares the living daylights out of most leaders of all backgrounds, out of entry-level employees of many backgrounds, certainly Gen X and older. The younger generations are less afraid of these conversations than my generation and those that preceded me, and that's a good thing. But that means that it's also a scarce and valued resource. So if I'm going to get up in the classroom and facilitate a conversation like this, and my colleagues are not capable and are nervous about whether or not that will come up, that should be recognized. When it's time for me to be evaluated, when it's time to give out merit increases, not to mention when it's time to make decisions about tenure and promotion. That's just one example within the academy, but you can think of many, many others. I would just, spin out from there just to be provocative, but also to give us some facts to go along with the provocation. Black women are the documented leaders of this work in diversity, equity, and inclusion. Look at Stephanie Creary and Diversity Inc.'s report that came out last year. Look at the McKinsey Lean In report that came out in November 2021. Yes, are women more likely to lead it than men? Yes. Are women of color more likely to lead it than white women? Yes. Who's most likely to lead this work? Black women. So when that boulder starts rolling back down the hill, who's it rolling on? The person who's been holding it. But guess what? Other people are being able to run past and advance while we're standing there holding that boulder, shaking, tremoring, about to nearly pass out. Don't think for a minute that we in our work as organizational caregivers, institutional caregivers, and we're disproportionately represented in healthcare and all other family caregiving occupations. We essentially play a role in the economy through our leadership and through our occupational status that helps to liberate other people to go forth and live their best lives and be their best selves. So the value needs to come from what we're contributing to the common good, and we've gotten it twisted. We talk about it as if we're asking for special accommodations for this small, unique subgroup. No, not at all. the things that we do in service of diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice are the kinds of actions that are creating greater liberty, equity, justice, and well-being for the entire organization. And anyone else who's involved in the work, likewise, is doing the same. Not to say Black women are the only ones who are doing that work, but we're often disappeared or devalued in the process of it.
You know, I want to go back to your analogy of the boulder up a hill. And I was just like, I use it all the time. I've always said, I feel like I'm pushing a boulder up a hill while I have daggers being tossed at my back. And that goes to exactly what you're talking about. I'm trying to do this, but I'm still dealing with microaggressions. I'm still dealing with racism. I'm still dealing with sexism. And it's like, I'm advocating for others and myself in this process. Right. And so it's very difficult work. And the other thing I wrote down as you were talking was, it's one thing to say, okay, we have a DEI leader, but are you giving them the resources that they need? Are they at the table making decisions? Are they the only decision maker when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion? And so everything comes to a stop because everybody's at that person's door because they aren't equipped to do what they need to do. And so they want to come to them to get approval, right? Because I see that a lot as well too, where nothing gets done because, oh, I have to go talk to Laura before I put this out. Well, it's like, you got two eyes and a brain. Like,
think about it this way, Sacha. You know, in an organization has a CFO. Does that mean that your middle managers are not responsible for managing their budgets? Of course not. Yeah. Of course not. You have a CEO, you might have a chief culture officer. Does that mean that nobody else in the organization is responsible for understanding your norms, your values, your protocols?
Right.
Of course not. With all of these other efforts, we expect that leaders of all levels of the organization will be sensitized toward and will be literate enough to support the organization's fair interest. But you're absolutely right. When it comes to the CDO or these other DEI leads, it's like everything rests on the shoulder of that one individual, and that can't be strategic or impactful.
And I completely agree with that. And a few things stick out. I think the number one challenge that organizations have is that they do not have manager accountability for these efforts. No. It starts at the top, and sometimes it starts at the bottom with grassroots efforts, but managers are not held accountable like they're held accountable for other things. And by the way, it's often seen by managers as something extra, something they have to do, you know, when they have time, or a nice to have thing. And, you know, to be fair, we know that managers are overworked and stretched thin, and they have a lot on their plate. And so, of course, anything that feels extra is going to fall by the wayside. And to me, that is the power of leaders to empower their managers and make it a necessity in the workplace, a necessity for good management in this company, a necessity for promotion, a necessity for bonus. You know, it has to be a necessity and not a nice to have thing or extra thing, or it's not going to get done because managers are already stretched thin. And I'd like to kind of double click on something that Laura said a few minutes ago when she mentioned the necessary skill and competence that is needed to do this work. That, you know, just because you're a person of color, and even just because you're passionate about it, doesn't mean that you automatically have. And I think it's so ironic, and it gives me a bit of whiplash, because I remember, you know, bringing this to the PhD project community. I remember when I was in grad school and I was advised explicitly to not study race, because if I was seen as a race scholar, then my opportunities in the academy would be limited. And thankfully, my lifelong mentor, Laura, you know, I was able to reach out, and she was like, nah, study what you want, you know, it will all work out. You will be able to make an impact. And I did as such, right? And so I think it's really fascinating from the academy and also outside that this work was not valued, you know, 10 plus years ago when I was in school, and likely before that as well, that now it's like the hot new thing, right? But you can't just wake up and be a DEI scholar. I have wonderful, you know, colleagues in the academy, as Laura mentioned, that they don't do this work and they're not trying to, but their institutions are now tapping on them for discrimination work and bias work, and can you teach this class on DEI? And you're like, I'm a team scholar, and so that is frustrating, and I think it must be acknowledged and mitigated, by us speaking up, and in the corporate space the same way. You can't just throw somebody in that role and expect them to flourish, which is why we see such high rates of attrition for all of those chief diversity officers that were hired in the past 2 years. So LinkedIn had a study that showed chief diversity officers had increased by like 4 times in the past 2 years. But the retention and the attrition has dramatically increased in those roles, partly because of resources. But I also think that part of that story is lack of competence and lack of skills and lack of support to even know how to do this work successfully.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to add to that. And just because you're in HR doesn't mean that you know DEI. Mm-hmm. Right? But that's a whole other conversation for a whole other day.
That's a whole other but an important conversation, because there's a level of threat that many leaders have, especially the middle managers throughout the organization. There's a level of threat and insecurity that comes in when they have to go through this process of unlearning and realizing that perhaps they've even contributed to the problem. And those that you think would be your most natural partners, oftentimes they're not open or willing to partner.
No. And there was a question in the chat, and I think we've kind of answered it a little bit around thoughts on people in DEI positions with little DEI experience, right? And I think you just touched on that. I know I can speak to my experience is working at a place where the head of DEI had never done DEI work and was proud and bold in telling people that. And was also causing a lot of damage in the process. So when I, who've been doing would bring things up, it was seen as a threat. Because who am I at an L6 to tell this L, whatever number she was, leader, how to do her job? But I'm like, when you have a diversity panel and it's all white women, and the one Black man on that panel's job is to talk about how he's an ally to them, that sends a message.
It really started to break my heart going back to let's rewind the clock 2 years ago and thinking, how did we get to where we are right now? And how did that play out?
Yeah.
And, there were some organizations who had reached out to me prior to George Floyd's public execution, because I had recently co-edited this volume, Race, Work, and Leadership, New Perspectives on the Black Experience. It was the first book that Harvard Business Review had published on race in about 20 years. Prior to that, they had published Our Separate Ways by Ella Bell and Stella Nkoma, which they just reissued, timeless, just as relevant today as it was before, and David Thomas and Jack Barrow's book, Breaking Through the Making of Minority Executives, yet still timeless as well. There's a lesson in that. But the Race, Work, and Leadership book, and Ella contributed to that volume as well, had just come out in the fall of 2019. We had run a series in Harvard Business Review, Advancing Black Leaders, in November, December of 2019. So I was already starting to have some conversations with organizations that said, yeah, we think we know a lot about DEI, and we're actually checking a lot of boxes and winning a lot of awards around gender, around veterans, around LGBTQIA. We still are not doing very well with race, or we should say with our Black employees in particular. And can you help us think about that? So no surprise then that in June 2020, a lot of these organizations who are industry leaders, because Bernardo asked a question earlier, like, well, how would you know what an organization is that's anti-racist? Well, you can't look at the top 50 organizations in DEI, because I was talking to many of them, and Ella was talking to many of them, and Sacha was talking to many of them, and they had no idea what to do around race, and particularly in having these difficult conversations about the Black experience.
And many of them paid to be on some of those lists.
And how can we have a conversation about race when we can't even say Black?
Exactly.
Right.
We can't say Black.
We can't say Black.
So then here's what really got me. By the end of the summer, when the task forces were formed, the people who had been in the room trying to get the organization to say Black were not included on the task forces.
Shocker.
To your point, Sacha.
Yeah.
You know, so I think we have to use a level of sophistication and precision around this work. It's not broad brush, DEI, B, J, and the whole alphabet. And I'm here for it because I love alliteration. But but when we're really thinking and talking about impact, we have to be specific. And I go back to the fact that we had this moment in time, we had this conversation, because globally, 30 countries around the world, it never happened before, all had protest movements at the same time to call to conscience around the ways in which Black people were being treated all over the world. I know our conversation has been pretty Americanized and localized because that's where we've done a lot of our research. But I know, Ella, you've done more global research than I have around this topic. So there are some implications and insights, I think, that for ways to think about doing this work in a wide range of communities that really focus on the experiences of marginalization and oppression, and don't just do a one size fits all DEI approach.
And I think for me, it always kind of gives me a pause and a moment to think about my words when folks say, well, what's new? What's different about DEI right now than it was, before, especially when they were asking that in 2020. And I'm like, to your point, Laura, have you not read the work of David Thomas? Have you not read the work of all of these people that have come before us that have been doing this work for the last 40 plus years? The work of DE&I is not new. You are just now joining the conversation. Welcome. And join us on this journey. And of course, things evolve over time, but it really perplexes me when people act like, there's some brand new thing that started to happen, or a brand new approach, or a brand new type of conversation. You were just now ready, or pretended to be ready, to have a conversation about race. But I've been trying to get y'all to talk about race in the workplace for the past 10 years, right? And some of the same clients that wanted to have those dialogues post 2020 were the same clients that prior to that would say, we have these engagement survey results, but we don't want to really drill down on the race results because we're not really ready to talk about that yet, or we're not sure how people will react. So let's just talk about gender, right? And so I think that other people have to acknowledge that they are joining the conversation, not that the conversation is new.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and Brian asked this question, how did the issue of racism in society become corporate America's issue to fix? How much of it is a shared responsibility between business and government? I guess I could answer that in two ways. I mean, one, whether or not you are willing and ready to engage in the work of racism in society, just start at home,
Exactly.
Racism in your own organization. Where does that take you? Can you break down your employee engagement data, as Ellen mentioned, and, draw some insight through that and use that to guide and spark your action? If you reduce the inequalities within your organization, it's going to have positive externalities for society, because you're going to help to reduce the wealth gap. You're going to help to reduce the toxicity, which then enhances the well-being of Black and Brown people and other marginalized groups when they're navigating toxic work environments filled with racism, sexism, and other forms of aggression, micro and macro, So solving internally is going to benefit society. But the other piece that I would say is that, businesses are always at the interface of society, because that's where you're drawing your consumers. Yep. That's where you're drawing your investors. So, why do we get to erect a fortress around, one set of social issues when we are, pretty aggressive and open-minded around how we can turn a dollar in different communities, whether be it consumers or investors?
And I wanted to, when you were talking about that, Laura, what comes up is we often hear, oh, my work self and my professional self, right? We like split our personalities somehow or the other. And back to Ella's point, I have a cousin who's been doing this work for 40 something years, right? And so her whole thing has been, well, what part of yourself do you leave at the door?
Yeah.
Because you don't, like, you bring your full self to work. So if you are having these conversations at work and you are building a skill set at work, take those skills home, have those conversations with your children, have those conversations with your families, right? Because that's also how you start to decide politically where you're going, what you're voting on, who you're like, it has implications, to your point, in other areas. It's not just work conversations that need to take place. These are about life and society and people. And that's the part I think we need to always be mindful of, right? We aren't just talking about people at work, because especially now when we work from home, like
it's all that blended. Whole thing open, didn't we?
It's all blended. So I'm being mindful of the time. Excuse me. There's one question that came up in the Q&A section. It says, as we look back on all the work that corporations have done, how might we find ways to encapsulate the work into continued actions?
So I can start with that one. I think there's twofold. So you have to center the humanity in the work. So I'm going to talk about metrics and accountability in a second, but before we get to that, you have to be very clear that you are doing this because you are centering humanity and everyone's right to be in a workplace where they can be seen, they can thrive, and that the environment is equitable and inclusive, period. It can't be for all those other reasons. That has to be your first reason. Now, what we know from the last 40 plus years is that if you do not connect it with some business strategies, that fact of where you should start will wane as attention and emotion and the news cycle wanes. So in addition to that, you do need to have some metrics, some short and long-term goals, some systems of tracking for accountability. You need some really direct directives around who's responsible for what. It needs to be really clear. It shouldn't be this like DEI thing that happens off in the corner. It should be really clear who is responsible for what outcomes and what happens if they don't meet those outcomes. Mm-hmm. I saw someone talk about Janet Stovall's TED Talk, and where she talks about making DEI real. One of the brilliant and but very basic things that she said, there should be consequences for not meeting these goals, just like there are consequences for any other type of responsibility that you have in organizations. And, it should be, right? We still haven't seen that. That's where we haven't gotten to. We've seen more organizations connect to things like bonuses, but they're afraid of having real implications of not meeting the needs around DEI. And so starting there, and I'll let Laura chime in because I'm sure there's so many other things they should be doing.
Yeah, I would add to that. I mean, it's not a one and done. Get that out of your head. Get out of your head that you're going to set some goals, you're going to meet them, and then you're going to have a big party and celebrate. Like any type of sustained effort in an organization that, seeks to differentiate itself through the quality of the services it provides, the outcomes that it generates. It's the mindset is continuous improvement. Your mindset is not, okay, let's throw some out there, stick it up on the wall. Okay, do we do it? And then we get to be celebrated by everybody because, look how great we are. This is committing to a long-term process of continuous improvement. How do you engage in continuous improvement? You have to continue to engage your stakeholders. And just go into a laboratory and, design some knockoff Juneteenth ice cream that you essentially appropriated the concept from a Black company that was already selling a similar ice cream in your store. That was the right. Walmart case. You can Google that. Right. What happens differently when you go out into the local community and you tell them, you engage them, you ask them, what would be a meaningful and significant way for us to recognize and acknowledge Juneteenth? How can we use this as an opportunity for your community? How does your community think that we're falling short with respect to, to our espoused aims and goals and values? See, that's the strategy, of continuous improvement. It's not a few people who already have some power, come up with a few things and then, execute them. That's going to make them feel good.
And
And they don't have to pat themselves on the back. And then there's no shift in the power dynamic. The shift is really opening up continuously. Because once again, let's be clear as we're wrapping up, to go back to 2020. Why did any of these leaders started doing it? It was because they woke up one day and said, I think we have a gap in our knowledge and understanding, and there's a big threat looming. No, they would have continued to ride that silence for, in perpetuity. They heard from stakeholders through social media, through town halls, through all of these different forums, and that required them to continue to act. So one of the things you mentioned, we talked about the middle management, being a little bit of a struggle area, but the grassroots, when we talk about a moment versus a movement, all the other movements that we're talking about, they're movements that are in response to grassroots efforts.
And if I can add just one other thing here that organizations really need to do better about is admitting their mistakes.
Yes.
I think as we talk about this journey of DEI, we talk about it in a way as if it's linear, and it is not. And one of the things that I really valued about the research I did for my forthcoming book, The Necessary Journey, Making Real Progress on Equity and Inclusion, is the companies that were brave enough to be honest about the things they didn't get right, about the ways they messed up. I remember talking to one executive, and they are in tech, and they had this whole program where they're supposed to amplify a minority business, et cetera, et cetera. They went through the process, and ultimately they didn't end up publishing the work of this group that worked so hard, just to make it simple. And that group then started to feel like, oh, so you created this program for us. It was just performative. So they lost engagement, they lost credibility and trust from something that started off well because they weren't really paying attention to it. They did it, and they weren't giving it the attention that they needed. And he candidly told me, we should do a panel on how we messed up DEI, how we dropped the ball on DEI. And part of that is sharing your story, right? Being honest about where you've hit the mark and where you've grossly missed the mark and what you've learned from that. And so that's what I feel like companies need to be bold and courageous to do, because we can all pat ourselves on the back. We can all look at transparency reports to see incremental changes, but where did you really mess up? Where did you say the wrong thing and you had to walk it all the way back? What can we learn from that? And until leaders individually and corporations collectively are brave enough to do that, then we won't see continued progress, because it is not a linear journey.
And that goes back to what was saying earlier around, you have to drop the ego, right? Oftentimes I say, this ain't about you. Like, once you realize it's not about you, then you can focus on other things and the impact on other people. So, oh my gosh, we are at time, we're close to time. And I usually ask, one or two nuggets that people can walk away with, but you all drop so many nuggets and gems and all kinds of stuff throughout that I think that there's just so much value in what has been said so far. And so just to kind of wrap it up, what I'm also hearing is companies need to just kind of dive deep, right? Be real with themselves, figure out, again, Ella, to your point, where have we made mistakes? Listen to the folks that are most impacted, but really think about how do we dive deep into these relationships so that they're long-term and sustainable, with the right resources, with the right people, with the right mindset, I guess is what I want to say too, right? You want to do it because you want to change things for the better and not to check a box. And so that's the transition. So thank you both. Any last words from you, Laura or Ella?
I just put
Just
mine
say-
in the chat.
Oh, thank you.
Ella, you
Lauren's
can have
always
it.
good for a quote. The only thing I would say for those of us doing this work, find your community, though that circle of trust, your academic friends, your professional friends, your friends who just get it. Because there are moments like after the Buffalo shooting, when I was enraged about the Juneteenth commercialization, that you need that safe space. And so I'm honored to be in that space with you, Laura. Thank you all for having me. And I look forward to the next time that all of us get together to talk about in 2 more years where we are.
Where we are. Thank you
Yes.
all so much. For those that are watching right now, if you want to be a part of a continued conversation on this, Laura and Ella won't be there. But we are going to have I'm going to have an open Zoom conversation. So I will drop that link in the chat for everyone right now. So definitely join us on Tuesday as we continue this conversation. Because to Ella's point, it's all about community and how do we stay connected and how do we continue to push ourselves and learn from each other in this space. So with that, I want to thank everyone for being a part. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Ella. Have wonderful, wonderful Juneteenth weekends. And happy Father's Day to all the fathers that are out there with us today. And thank you to the PhD Project for being a wonderful partner in this space. And we will see you in September with our next episode. So have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you,
Take care.
Sacha. Take
Thank
care.
you, Sasha.